Here's a question nobody asked about Vietnam. If radios got men killed because the antenna made them visible, why did soldiers die at night? Why did they die in dense canopy where nothing was visible? Why did they die seconds after transmitting from positions the enemy couldn't possibly see? The antenna wasn't the problem. The transmission was. August 1968. Captain James Morrison arrived at Nui Dat with 3 Vietnam tours behind him and a specific assignment in front of him. American command wanted to understand why Australian SAS patrols were operating for weeks inside territory where American units lasted days. His job was to find out. Let's watch what he noticed first. Not the heat, not the layout of the base, not the equipment or the weapons or the state of the uniforms. The silence. 5 men sat around a table built from ammunition crates. None of them stood when Morrison entered. He'd been warned about Australian informality. What he hadn't been warned about was this. One man cleaned his weapon with cloth that made no sound against metal. Another turned patrol notes with a care that prevented even paper from rustling. A third sat completely still. Not the restless stillness of a man waiting, but the absolute stillness of a man who had stopped generating unnecessary movement entirely. Morrison had worked alongside Green Berets, Force Recon Marines, Korean Special Forces. He had never walked into a room and heard nothing. These men weren't quiet. They were trained to silence. The patrol leader, Sergeant Collins, acknowledged Morrison with a brief nod and outlined the mission parameters. 5-man patrol, 3 days, Hat Ditch. Morrison knew the area. Multiple American battalions had been tracked, ambushed, and destroyed there. By 1968, American ground forces were effectively barred from the region. When Morrison asked about radio checks, Collins's answer stopped him cold. 2 scheduled transmissions. Total, 90 seconds each. Across 72 hours. Morrison did the math. 90 seconds of radio contact inside territory American battalions had been destroyed trying to operate in. No hourly check-ins. No umbilical cord back to command. No constant reassurance that someone knew where they were. Every instinct from 3 tours told him this was wrong. The radio wasn't just communication. It was control. The difference between a unit operating alone and a unit operating abandoned. Collins's explanation was simple and left no room for argument. The enemy listened to everything. Every transmission, every check-in, every routine call that American units considered standard procedure. So the Australians said nothing. Morrison wrote that down, stared at it. He would spend the next 72 hours discovering exactly what that meant. Let's talk about what was actually happening on the other side of the jungle, because this is the part American commanders knew about, documented, filed reports on, and then continued to ignore for the remainder of the war. While American patrols moved through Vietnam, talking constantly into their microphones, the North Vietnamese army had built an intelligence apparatus that required no informants, no satellites, and no aerial reconnaissance. It required only a radio receiver and a man who knew how to listen. Enemy signals intelligence teams operated across South Vietnam continuously. Some were small, 2 or 3 men with basic receivers and notebooks. Others were larger units, equipped with direction-finding technology capable of triangulating a transmitter's position within minutes of a transmission beginning. Their operators spoke fluent English. They understood American military jargon. They knew the difference between a forward observer and a platoon leader simply by how a man spoke under stress. They could identify units by their call signs, track movement patterns through grid references, and anticipate operations before they began simply by monitoring the increase in radio traffic that always preceded American action. Here's what that meant in practice. Every routine check-in added a data point. Every position report narrowed a location. Every casual transmission under stress revealed intention. Over days and weeks, those data points formed patterns. Units that checked in every 30 minutes. Commanders who favored certain routes. Patrols that lingered near water sources. Helicopter insertions announced minutes in advance by radio chatter that the crews considered too brief to matter. By listening alone, the enemy often knew more about American movements than American units knew about themselves. Morrison had seen the consequences before arriving at Nui Dat. He just hadn't recognized the cause. Operations unraveling before first contact. Ambushes appearing with impossible precision. Fire bases shelled exactly as resupply helicopters arrived. The explanation was always the same. Bad luck, poor terrain, a clever enemy. But luck doesn't repeat itself with that kind of consistency. The Army Security Agency had been filing warnings for years. Thousands of communications security violations recorded during training alone. Real names, plain language locations, operational details transmitted openly before combat stress made discipline even harder to maintain. The reports reached commanders. The recommendations were noted and ignored because American doctrine treated the radio as a lifeline. Constant communication meant constant control. Silence meant uncertainty. And uncertainty was the one thing American command culture was designed to eliminate, regardless of the cost. The Australians had looked at this logic and reached the opposite conclusion. Silence wasn't uncertainty. Silence was protection. Every transmission, regardless of encryption, regardless of brevity, created a signal, and signals could be found. The enemy couldn't ambush what it couldn't locate. It couldn't locate what it couldn't hear, and it couldn't hear a patrol that refused to speak. Morrison sat with this understanding as the patrol prepared to step into Hatditch the following morning. He switched off his radio. For the first time in 3 tours, the static went quiet. And in that quiet, he heard something he hadn't expected. The jungle. They moved before dawn. Single file. 20 meters between each man. A spacing that felt immediately wrong to Morrison. American doctrine kept patrols tight, maintaining visual contact, ensuring no man was left isolated in the dark. These men disappeared into the darkness ahead of him within seconds. But here's what Morrison noticed as he followed. He couldn't hear them. Not reduced noise. Not careful movement. Complete absence of sound. When the patrol passed through dense undergrowth, vegetation parted slowly and returned to position as if nothing had moved through it. No snapping branches, no rustling leaves, no equipment rattle, no footfall compression against wet earth. They weren't moving through the jungle. They were erasing themselves from it. Morrison tried to match their movement, placed his feet with care, controlled his breathing, moved his arms slowly through undergrowth rather than pushing. He still made noise. He could hear himself making it. And if he could hear it, something else could too. What Morrison was beginning to understand, and what American doctrine had never fully accepted, was that the jungle around him wasn't just terrain. It was a nervous system. Every sound had meaning. Bird behavior indicated movement direction and distance. Insect patterns changed when large mammals disturbed their environment. The way sound traveled through canopy and undergrowth at different times of day created a landscape of acoustic information that experienced operators could read like a map. The Australians didn't move through this system as invaders trying to minimize damage. They moved as components of it, slowly enough that the ecosystem absorbed them rather than registering them as disturbances. American patrols moved fast because speed felt like safety. Get through the dangerous ground quickly, reduce exposure time, cover distance. But speed created noise. Noise created signatures. Signatures created targets. The Australians moved slowly because slowness was invisibility. Dawn broke in layers of grey and green. The patrol had been in position for hours without Morrison noticing the transition from movement to stillness. Each man had simply stopped at some point and become part of the vegetation around him. No defensive perimeter established, no cleared fields of fire, no sentries posted in rotation. Just 5 men who had ceased to exist as detectable presences in the jungle. Morrison checked his watch. Back at American bases across Vietnam, radios would already be crackling. Morning reports, status updates, weather checks, hundreds of transmissions announcing presence, movement, intention to anyone with a receiver pointed in the right direction. The Australian said nothing. Morrison sat with his radio switched off and realized something that 3 tours hadn't taught him. He could actually hear the jungle now, not as background noise to be filtered out, as information. Every sound had a source. Every change in that sound had a meaning. He had been operating in this environment for years without ever actually listening to it. The Australians had been listening the entire time, and what Collins heard next would show Morrison exactly what that meant. At 07:20, a bird called from the east. 3 sharp notes, evenly spaced, the kind of sound that registers as background jungle noise to anyone who hasn't been trained to hear otherwise. Collins's hand moved instantly. 2 fingers pointed east, then clenched into a fist. The patrol shifted almost imperceptibly, weapons orienting toward the sound without a single body rising from its position. Morrison followed their lead, his eyes scanning the tree line, finding nothing. He heard more bird calls. Different birds, different directions. The jungle sounded exactly like a jungle. 20 minutes passed in absolute stillness. Then another call, similar to the first, but wrong in a way Morrison couldn't immediately identify. The rhythm was too precise, the interval between notes too consistent. Collins' hand moved again. Different signal this time. The patrol's stillness deepened into something Morrison could only describe as held breath extended across 5 human beings simultaneously. They waited. Nothing happened. The sounds faded. The jungle resumed its normal register. When Collins finally spoke, the first sound Morrison had heard from any of them in hours, it was barely above a breath. An enemy patrol, 4 or 5 men, moving parallel to their position approximately 80 meters north, signaling to each other using bird calls that were accurate enough to fool casual listeners, but too mechanical to fool someone who had spent months learning the difference. Morrison processed this. Let's think about what American doctrine would have demanded at that moment. Contact report, immediate transmission, enemy presence, approximate numbers, grid reference, direction of movement. The information passed up the chain, Guidance received, action authorized. Standard procedure. The kind of response drilled into every American soldier from the first week of training. Every part of that procedure would have required transmitting, and transmitting would have told the enemy patrol exactly where they were. The Australians had done nothing. They had detected a patrol, assessed it as non-threatening to the mission, noted its presence, and filed it in their collective memory without producing a single sound in response. Morrison realized he had been holding his breath. At 1300 hours, the first scheduled transmission window arrived. Let's watch this closely, because what Morrison witnessed in the next 90 seconds reframed everything he thought he understood about communication in the field. Collins assembled the radio with practiced efficiency, wrote his message on a one-time pad in numerical groups that Morrison could barely interpret even while watching over his shoulder. Grid references reduced to codes, observations compressed to indicators. An entire morning of intelligence gathering distilled into something that looked more like a mathematics exercise than a field report. At exactly 1300, Collins switched the radio on, transmitted in Morse code, received a brief acknowledgement, switched the radio off. Morrison checked his watch against the transmission start time. 47 seconds. He stared at Collins, waiting for the second part. The confirmation. The follow-up questions from command. The routine exchange that American doctrine built entire communications schedules around. There was no second part. 47 seconds was the entire exchange. Everything the patrol had observed, compressed, and transmitted in less time than it took to drink a cup of coffee. And now, the radio was off. The signature was gone, and anyone who had been trying to locate that transmission had a 47-second window that was already closed. Morrison wrote the number in his notebook. 47 seconds. That evening, the patrol established an observation position overlooking a trail junction that Australian intelligence had identified as a primary Viet Cong movement route. They had been motionless for 3 hours when the enemy appeared. 7 men. Moving with the relaxed confidence of soldiers operating in territory they considered completely their own. Weapons slung rather than carried. Talking in low voices. The body language of men who felt no threat in their immediate environment. They were 15 meters from the Australian position. Let's be very clear about what 15 meters means. It's the length of a standard living room. Close enough to hear individual voices. Close enough to read facial expressions. Close enough that Morrison could count the magazines on the nearest soldier's chest rig without moving anything except his eyes. The enemy had no idea anyone was watching. American protocol at this moment would have been automatic. Observe, count, report, a transmission requesting instructions, permission to engage, or orders to continue surveillance. Any transmission would have changed everything. Even encrypted, even brief, even perfectly disciplined, the act of transmitting would have created a signal. And a signal would have told 7 armed men that something nearby was generating radio frequency emissions. Behavior would have changed. Weapons would have come up. The comfortable confidence would have shifted into something more dangerous. The Australians remained silent. They watched, they counted, they memorized faces, weapons, equipment, direction of travel, spacing between men, physical condition, everything that could later be rendered into intelligence without a single syllable being spoken. The enemy patrol disappeared into the tree line. Collins allowed himself the slightest adjustment of expression. somewhere between satisfaction and confirmation. The third group today, he noted quietly, and they were getting sloppy. Morrison finally understood what silence actually provided. Not just concealment from enemy patrols passing nearby, not just protection from signals intelligence units with direction-finding equipment. Something more fundamental than either of those things. Silence gave the Australians something American doctrine had accidentally traded away for the comfort of constant communication. It gave them the ability to see without being seen, to know without being known, to watch an enemy move through his own territory with complete confidence, while 5 men 15 meters away recorded everything he did. That was what Collins had meant in the briefing room. The Americans were always hunting the enemy. The Australians let the enemy come to them. And the enemy always did, because the enemy never knew anyone was there. The patrol ended the way it had begun, in silence. When the extraction helicopter appeared above the canopy on day 3, Collins transmitted a single short burst to guide it in. No call signs, no conversation, just enough signal to be found. The helicopter touched down, the patrol lifted out, and the jungle closed behind them as if 5 men had never passed through it. Back at Nui Dat, Morrison sat through a debrief that reframed everything he'd witnessed. Australian intelligence officers had been running patrols like this for years. Dozens of silent operations, each one adding observations to a picture that no single radio report could have provided. Patterns had emerged from the accumulated silence. Trail usage schedules, staging area locations, movement timelines tied to weather and moon cycles, supply route rotations. None of it had been gathered through aggressive contact or constant communication. All of it had been gathered by men who went in, said nothing, watched everything, and came back with information that was accurate because it had never been contaminated by the compromise that transmitting invites. Morrison filed his report 3 days later. Let's look at what that report actually said. Because the recommendations were specific enough that ignoring them was a choice, not an oversight. Reduce routine radio checks to scheduled windows only. Train all operators in Morse code and one-time pad encryption. Enforce radio silence except in genuine emergencies. Treat communications security violations with the same severity as weapons negligence. The report documented what Morrison had seen with his own eyes. The bird call that revealed an enemy patrol without a single transmission being made. The 47-second window that gave enemy direction-finding equipment nothing to work with. 7 enemy soldiers walking 15 meters from an Australian position with complete confidence because nothing had told them anyone was there. The evidence was precise. The recommendations were direct. The logic was undeniable. The Pentagon filed it, not acted on it, not distributed it, filed it, because implementing those recommendations would have required something more disruptive than new equipment or updated training manuals. It would have required changing command culture itself, accepting that less communication could mean more control, trusting small units to operate alone without constant reassurance, acknowledging that the doctrine built on overwhelming firepower and constant contact had a fundamental flaw that no amount of technology could fix. That acknowledgement never came. American radio operators continued keying their microphones every 30 minutes. Enemy signals intelligence units continued listening, plotting, and directing ambushes with precision that kept being attributed to bad luck. The life expectancy of a radio man remained measured in seconds. Not because the antenna was visible, because the transmission was audible. The war ended in 1975. The lessons didn't. In the years that followed, elements of what Morrison had documented began filtering into American special operations through channels that rarely acknowledged their origin. Navy SEALs adopted scheduled transmission windows. Army Special Forces began training in burst communication techniques. Reconnaissance units started treating radio discipline as a tactical priority rather than an administrative inconvenience. The change was slow, partial, never officially credited to what a handful of Australians had been proving in Phuoc Tuy province since 1966. But it came. Captured enemy documents declassified years after the war revealed what the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army had recorded about Australian forces. The assessments were direct. Australian patrols could not be heard. Their movement patterns were unpredictable. Their presence was undetectable until contact occurred, at which point they were already gone. The enemy used a specific term for them that appeared in no assessment of any other Allied force. Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. Not because they were invisible to the eye, because they were inaudible to the ear. Morrison kept a single artifact from his 3 days in Hat Ditch. A one-time pad sheet, blank, never used. A reminder of the transmissions that hadn't been made, the words that hadn't been spoken, the 47 seconds that had been enough. He'd arrived at Nui Dat believing he understood jungle warfare. He'd left understanding that the most dangerous sound in a jungle isn't incoming fire. It's your own voice.